Hi everyone, I'm going to give you a minute to log in from the waiting room and get our closed captions up and running. I know I've been doing this for a long time, but those closed captions make me nervous every time. I'm sure it's not going to bring me back to the main page. Okay, the closed caption should be up and running. You'll see the red live box if you want to follow along. I am so excited to have our panelists with us today. Before I forget, I'm Christy Baglow, the Director of Statewide Training, for those of you who are not tired of seeing my face for the last year and a half. Today we have a gender equity panel with two ABA past presidents, so I am thrilled to have them here. I want to thank Afrasan Adams at Bay Area Legal Services for connecting us with these great speakers, and to the Public Interest Law section for co-sponsoring this webinar. At the top of your screen, we have Trish Refo. She is a partner at the law offices of Snell and Wilmer. She is the immediate past president of the ABA. Her practice is concentrated in complex commercial litigation and internal investigations, which sounds like a really neat variety of work to me. She chairs the firm's professional liability litigation group, and she is a sought-after speaker at international, national, state, and local CLEs. So I'm so thankful to have her here today. She is a thought leader on litigation and trial issues and has been named one of the most influential women lawyers in the country. So thank you for being here today, Trish. And next we have Hilarie Bass. She is the president and founder of the Bass Institute for Diversity and Inclusion. After more than 35 years working in the male-dominated field of law, Hilarie realized that companies are not doing their best to utilize all the valuable talent in the workforce. And she founded the Bass Institute because she knew firsthand that the problem of retaining and elevating women in the C-suite was far from solved. So I'm thrilled to have them here today just to have a casual fireside type chat about their work individually and their work as ABA past presidents. The ABA has done a lot of great research, and I'll link to the reports in the chat as we get started. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being here.
We're delighted, both of us, to be here. And I hope folks will put questions in the chat as we go here. I think Christy's going to monitor it, and we'll also, save time for questions at the end. So I just wanted to start us out by reminding everybody of a moment in history, which some of you may be too young to have lived through, but Hilarie and I lived through, which we're about to celebrate an anniversary of next week, because next week is the 40th anniversary of the swearing in of Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman on the United States Supreme Court. And I have been thinking about that because being from Phoenix, Arizona, I have two programs to do in the next few days about the legacy of Justice O'Connor. And so it has caused me to reflect on the last 40 years in particular, because I was a law student when Justice O'Connor was put on the court. And I remember literally where I was when I watched her swearing in. I mean, it was that kind of a big moment. And it changed my world, truly changed my world, because I went to law school, frankly, not thinking about the notion that a woman could ever be on the United States Supreme Court, just because it had never happened. So in my career, in Hilarie's career, the change from the first woman on the Supreme Court to where we are today has been remarkable. And yet there is enormous work remaining to be done. One of the things that I think Hilarie and I both believe is that to be a change agent, you have to both be able to acknowledge the progress that you've seen and see with clarity what else remains to be done. So that's, I think, something of what we want to talk about today. Right, Hilarie?
Exactly. And one of the things that the American Bar Association has been very focused on over the last few years is coming to terms with the fact that 30, 40 years ago, there was this assumption that the lack of women in senior leadership at law firms and government, et cetera, was just a pipeline problem. that there were fewer of us who went to law school 30, 40 years ago. And so over time, this problem would just eliminate by itself. And what we now know is that there have been more than 50% of law students have been women for more than 20 years now. The University of Miami this year, my alma mater, had 56% of the entering class being women. And yet what we see is when you go out there into the profession, women continue to leave at literally twice the level of men. And at each level of partnership or government or NGOs, there are fewer and fewer women at the top. So the American Bar Association has spent a lot of time and effort researching what's happening. Why are women leaving the profession, and why are women not being elevated at the same level? And I think what the most important thing that we've come out of this with is that this is not an intentional issue. No one is explicitly biased against women, or there may be some people are, but they certainly won't admit it. But what we're dealing with is in many ways the kind of implicit biases about expectations of the way women should behave versus the way men should behave. And in male-dominated fields like law, this does create certain challenges for the ability of women to reach the same level of success as comparable men. And so what we've spent a lot of time doing is trying to come up with, how do we solve this problem? And we'll be referring to a number of the reports and research projects that the ABA has done over the last few years, really focused on how do we solve this.
Well, and we should just share that among the groups at the American Bar Association that focuses on this issue is the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession, which was established a long time ago to focus specifically on the issues that that face women in the law, in all aspects of the law, and actually footnote the first chair of the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession was from Little Rock, Arkansas. She was a lawyer named Hilarie. And so she launched the work of the commission. And this many years later, it is one of the leading, if not the leading, research group looking at issues around women in the law. And Hilarie, during her year as president, had a particular focus not just on women generally, but on this question of more senior women leaving the profession and why that happens. We are going into a year, and Hilarie talked about University of Miami Law School, the entire law school class coming in this year, I think collectively is predominantly women. There are a number of law schools that are reporting, like Miami is, that they have more women than men in their law school classes. And the issue becomes, how do we keep them in our profession? What is it about the law, the demands of the law, and the rules and mores of our profession that make it hard for women? And Hilarie, that's one of the things that the studies you launched looked at in particular.
And what we basically found was that women don't leave the practice because of one singular thing. I've heard it referenced death by 1,000 cuts. And basically it's the perception that many women lawyers have that, for example, the day they became a mother, it suddenly impacted the assumption about their level of commitment to the profession, that it potentially impacted the kind of projects they were invited to participate on, or the kind of clients that they were exposed to. The perception that somehow women have to perform at a higher level to get a comparable level of recognition than the male colleague to their right and to their left. The idea that what we know, study after study shows us that when it comes to putting in for promotions, for example, if there are 10 criteria for a promotion, if a woman has 8, the typical response is, well, I'm going to work really hard this coming year to get experience in those other 2. If a man has 5, he'll put his resume in and say, well, I'll learn the rest on the job. And what we all recognize is the consequence of that is that there are many more men in the pool of potential people to be promoted. One of them ends up being promoted. And right then and there, from that point forward in your career, you're playing a secondary role to this male colleague. So there are some certain things that I think it's important for women to examine in themselves. Not that they need to behave like men. That's not at all what we're suggesting. But we do want to make sure that some of our own cultural limitations are not holding us back, that we're not self-examining and limiting ourselves, so that if we are missing two of the criteria for a promotion, we hesitate to put our name in. And that plays out when we ask for money, when we ask for promotions, when we make decisions about whether or not to leave our current place of employment and seek a different one. And it's really important for women to evaluate whether or not they're imposing their own limitations that are perhaps preventing them from being as successful as they could be.
Well, and one of the things that Hilarie and I both have personally experienced and watched other women experience over the course of our careers is frankly the importance of asking for what you want. I had to learn, I'm just talking about me, I had to learn how to do that because I had this notion that somehow somebody was going to knock on my door and offer something to me once I had earned it. And to say that out loud sounds stupidly naive, but I literally had that in my head as a young lawyer. And I had to teach myself and have others teach me how to go and ask for what I wanted, whether it was in the organized bar or in a client situation where, a partner, when I was still an associate, was handing out work. I had to learn to go knock on a partner's door and go, there's this thing coming up, this deposition, this motion, argument, whatever. I want to do it. Not sort of a, would you please think about whether I might be able to do it, but just saying flat out, I'd really like to do that and I'm ready. I had to learn to do that. So I encourage, whether it is talking about how much you earn, as Hilarie said, or your next promotion, or what you want to be doing in the organized bar or whatever. Ask for what you want and make it known.
And the second piece of that is to learn how to handle rejection. Because some of those times you're going to make those asks and you're going to be told, no, I don't think you're ready, or maybe next year, or maybe the next opportunity. And that's okay, because you don't have to personalize that. I think sometimes men are better at handling rejection because they're the ones asking women out for dates. So their hand gets slapped a lot and they learn to deal with it and not personalize it. I know in my own experience, my first management position in my law firm was to be head of this small litigation group. And I had to ask my managing partner 3 times. Once a year, I would knock on his door and say, I really have some great ideas. I'd like you to give me the opportunity. And 3 times he said, there, yeah, I'll keep you in mind. And finally on the 4th, and don't ask me what possessed me to go ahead, keep asking, I got that opportunity. And it started me on a path of management jobs where at that point, because I was able to perform and I was able to succeed in the position, it was a whole lot easier to ask for the next one. But the point that Trish is making is absolutely critical. You need to evaluate, what is it that you want for your own career and how do I get it? And that's always going to involve, number 1, asking for it, and number 2, informing other people of what your goals are. Because if you simply want to be a practicing lawyer, that's great. But if you'd love to be in a management position or have the opportunity to lead a group, no one's going to know that unless you express that desire. And that takes, number 1, you articulating for yourself what your goals are, and then 2, feeling comfortable expressing it to somebody else. Even if when you first let those words out of your mouth, it feels quite uncomfortable and you're thinking, they're going to think I'm aggressive or bossy or ambitious. That's okay. I've never heard the word ambitious used in a negative way other than for women, but you have to own that. There's nothing wrong with having a goal for your future and going after it and getting it, but it's not going to happen unless you make the first ask.
One of my mentors expressed it to me years ago in a way that I just have carried around with me ever since. It's that nobody is ever going to care more about your career than you do. Doesn't matter how many mentors you have, doesn't matter how many friends in high places you have, you are responsible for your own career because you're going to care, you care about it more than anybody's ever gonna. So make things happen, you know, for yourself is one of the most important pieces in all of this. But Hilarie, maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened recently in the COVID situation.
Sure.
To women and to women lawyers, because there's some important research that the American Bar Association has done in the last year that tells us pretty clearly that this pandemic in the legal profession has had a disproportionate impact on women, and even more so women of color. You want to talk about that a little bit, and
Sure.
I'll chime in some?
So what we know is generally, not just the law, but generally in the US, more than 2 million women have left the workforce during COVID. And the explanations are obvious. If you have school children at home and no childcare, what option do you have? And since we know that 80% of the women in heterosexual relationships are typically the second earner, meaning they make significantly less than their male partner, when someone has to make the cut of cutting back on hours or taking time out of the workplace, it's likely to be the women. And in law, this is similarly reflected in the numbers. There's also a recognition that being on Zoom is not necessarily a positive for the ability of implicit bias to impact people's judgment of what you're doing. When you're in the office next door, everybody sees what time you come in and what time you leave. They see you working hard all day. When, on the other hand, you're telecommuting and no one really sees what you're doing, there's a much greater tendency for those implicit biases to seep in. And so the person you work for is much more likely to say, I bet she's taking care of her kids because I know they're home from school. Because there's not that transparency over what your productivity actually is. Not to mention that when you have the 3-year-old walk in on a Zoom meeting and say, Mommy, I'm hungry, this also helps to reinforce the assumptions that you're caring more about your mom role than your lawyer role. And so it's been a real challenge. We also know from some recent studies that women are less likely to speak up on Zoom calls. They're more likely to be interrupted. And so some of those inherent biases that in the workplace we've spent years tamping down have come back to the surface in the Zoom environment.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. And the other thing that I think we need to be really careful about in this remote environment is the mentoring and intangible experiences that we're accustomed to sharing with each other when we're in person. I, for example, learned a whole bunch about how to be a lawyer by sitting in the office of an older lawyer when I was, a dweeb, and watching how that lawyer dealt with particular situations, or just being grabbed to come into the office while, the senior lawyer was on some client call or dealing with some kind of situation. All of that's, at least for those of us who aren't yet back in our offices, all of that's gone now, or much of it is gone now. And we have to be right now much more intentional. Those of us who are in more senior positions, much more intentional about the mentoring that we do, because the sort of the random opportunities to mentor increasingly aren't happening because we're not together in one place to be able to do it. And I think that's a really serious consequence of not being physically together in the same place.
And I think it's something that we're all going to deal with even post-COVID, because obviously what we've learned about this requirement to be out of the office is that many of us can be as productive, perhaps more productive than we were when we were spending an hour commuting each way, or perhaps not taking an hour and a half for lunch every day because your colleagues ask you to go out. So how do we ensure that once we do return to a post-pandemic world and people expect that they're going to want to continue to work at home at least part of the time, how do we ensure that we are able to train the young people, as Trish suggested, to get those spontaneous opportunities for mentorship or just observing how a particular problem of a client is handled by your mentor or your senior person? We're going to have to ensure that we create those opportunities, because young lawyers will really miss out if they don't get that exposure. And oh, by the way, the senior people are going to be as anxious to work in part from home as the young lawyers. And so we're really going to have to work through how we ensure that the most important kind of training, which we all had the benefit of, which is standing at the feet of the master and observing how they handle particular situations, how we can ensure we're giving that opportunity to young lawyers.
Yeah, and I don't know what differences these things will, how these differences may manifest in a legal services practice setting in a different way. I mean, obviously, my experience is a big law experience, and before she founded the Institute, Hilarie's experience was as well, a big law experience. But my instincts tell me that all of these issues are going to translate. They may translate slightly differently, but the underlying issue is the same, frankly, no matter the practice setting. I mean, we'd all love to believe that in a legal services world where people are motivated to be there because they are helping people and doing the right thing, you know, and are keeping their eye on the North Star of how we treat one another, we'd like to think that the world is better in a legal services environment. I'm not certain that that's right, because as Hilarie was talking about before, much of what we're dealing with is stuff that is embedded in the way in which our institutions work and operate and how the legal profession is structured. It's not as much any longer explicit bias, but it is systemic things about how we are set up as a profession and what the expectations are of lawyers that continue to operate in many ways to the detriment of women. And those are harder to root out in a way than the intentional bias. I did want to share though, just because it was kind of amazing, not just kind of amazing. There was an article yesterday about a judge in New Jersey who was disciplined because in talking to a domestic violence defendant, the judge talked about the fact that the defendant needed to find a different way to teach the women that he was in control than punching them. He said, among other things, he told the suspect that women are created on a curve, the judge said, quote, "But we as men, we think we are above creation and we can straighten it out. No matter how much you try or how you try to straighten out that curve, you can never do it." And on and on and on. It is astonishing to me that here we are, the 21st century, and a judge would say, there's still a judge who would say something like that. And okay, he got disciplined, but the fact that he got on the bench and could say such a thing in the first place tells us we still have work to do on the explicit bias part of it as well, right, Hilarie?
Absolutely. Well, let me mention one other thing that I think is going to raise a particular concern for women in this telecommuting world. And that is women are particularly bad at self-promotion. I think it all goes down to when we were 4 or 5 and little girls wanted to sit in a circle with their other little girlfriends and play dolls or whatever, and they all wanted to get along with everybody. While the little boys were out on the Corey field, you know, banging their chest saying, I'm the fastest, I'm the best, I'm the whatever. And those kind of cultural things that we've all grown up with impact our behavior as lawyers. And so one fascinating study showed that when women do those year-end self-evaluations, they oftentimes leave a significant amount out and describe their work in a much more limited way than a comparable man. And so in this study, they actually had a colleague write the year-end evaluation for the woman lawyer rather than having her write it herself. And the consequence was that her compensation or her increase went up significantly more. Why? Because women have a tendency to self-limit. They say, well, I could mention this victory, but you know, I was only one of a team. Or I could mention this case, but you know, I took it over from somebody else, so maybe I shouldn't take credit. So part of what we need to do, particularly in this telecommuting world, is to feel comfortable talking about ourselves in a positive way. Take credit for the good work that we've done and not be the one that's always saying, second guessing yourself and saying, well, I really shouldn't take credit for that. There's this great anecdote about a young male and female associate who come back from a big hearing and they're standing in the coffee room and the male associate is saying, wow, we hit it out of the park this morning. The judge loved us. He's gonna, you know, we're gonna win. The argument was great. And the female associate sitting there with her mouth open saying, neither one of us opened our mouth. We handed the cases to the senior lawyer. How could he possibly take credit for it? But this is not an uncommon reaction because male lawyers on the whole feel much more comfortable for taking credit for things that they perhaps only had a very small part in than women lawyers. And we can oftentimes be our own worst enemy because if we don't articulate our successes, no one else around us is going to. And in an environment where we don't actually see the good work because we're not in an office across the hall from one another, but we're all at home on a Zoom, it becomes even more important to learn to feel comfortable to say, I had a great victory today. I'm really proud of what I accomplished. And that's a critical thing that women have to address.
Well, and it is unfortunately still true that in pretty much all aspects of the law, women are paid less than our male colleagues. The studies, you know, continue to show that, which really kind of makes you want to pull your hair out. I mean, I keep saying this is 2021 for Pete's sake. How can that still be true? But it is still true. There are fewer women in leadership positions in our profession. Pick your spot, than there should be. It's better in the judiciary for sure than it used to be. It's better in law schools by a lot than it used to be. I mean, when I showed up at the University of Michigan on my first day of law school, on the entire faculty of the University of Michigan Law School, there were 2 women. 2 women. One, a woman of color. How do you as a lawyer sort of even begin to learn how to do what you do when you have nobody who looks like you to teach you? Now, it's better today, and it should be, and it's better in our profession. I was the 10th woman president of the American Bar Association. That's real progress, because when I showed up at law school, there had never been any woman president of the American Bar Association or any person of color president of the American Bar Association. So again, it's a point of, yes, we've made progress, and yet there is still so much more that needs to be done. Our law schools need to continue their work to diversify, to present to law students who are coming up into our profession, present examples to them of women who are white, women of color, men of color, to make sure that every single law student can pick his or her head up, or their head up, and see somebody as a professor who looks like, in quotes, them, with whom that particular law student can identify. And those are the things that are ultimately going to be part of accomplishing the remaining work that we have in front of us to do.
So somebody wrote in the chat and said, well, how do you learn to self-advocate? And I know it's something that many of us are uncomfortable with. And I'll give you one suggestion, and it may or may not work for you, but people often talk about you have to have an elevator speech to describe who you are and what you do, what your area of specialty is. And I think self-promotion is very much like that. And when it's difficult for you, my recommendation is write a little script for yourself. It's only got to be 3 or 4 sentences, and memorize it and talk to the mirror until it is so comfortable that you don't even think about all your personal concerns about getting those words out of your mouth. And literally practice it until it's so natural that you can go in and say, okay, start the script. And you get those words out of your mouth without all the restrictions that if you thought about, should I really say this? Should I say that? You just do it. And I promise you, the more you do it and you see the positive reaction, oh, wow, that's a great victory. That's wonderful. I didn't know that. The more you will feel comfortable that you don't have to be embarrassed about saying that you do good work. I mean, that's all what we're trying to do. We're trying to come up with solutions for our clients. We're trying to solve their problems for them. And if you're successful at it, you should be proud of it. And don't be embarrassed about going into your supervisor and saying, I got a great summary judgment today for this young family that's going to change their life. Because you did. And it's okay to take credit for it. But unless you blow your own horn, chances are there's nobody else out there that is going to know about all your successes. And so you're not going to get credit for them. So it's critically important that you do that.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Hilarie. And part and parcel of that is sort of goal setting, right? Is taking the time, each of us individually, to say, what do I want to accomplish this year? What do I want? Where do I want to be in 5 years? And spend the self-reflective time to identify the concrete goals about what you want to do with your professional life, and then put together a bit of a plan for how you are going to get yourself to that goal. Because that goes back to taking charge of our own careers and being the stewards of our own careers. And that requires you to know where you want it to go in the first place, which sounds basic, but I'm not sure that all of us do as much work as we should to get where we want to be.
And it's one thing to say you want to be a successful lawyer, that's a given, but what does that mean? Do I want to be a supervisor in my office? Do I want to go into private practice at some point? Whatever it is, and I may be nerdy, but I always find if I write it down, I don't care if it's in the notes section of your phone, it can be 1 sentence. But I have always found once you write it down, even if I never look at it again, it's much more embedded in my brain. And once a month, I'll stop and think, what am I doing to accomplish this goal? And then once a year, you need to sit back and say, has my goals changed? Because they will. There might be a time where you're taking care of a small child or an elderly parent and your priorities change. And you say, you know what, for the next couple of years, I'm going to give myself this time off the promotion ladder because this is my priority. And that's okay, because careers are long and priorities are going to change. And it's not possible to ever be in a trend line that just goes straight in one direction. So
another way to
evaluate.
Another way to think about that is a colleague of mine, and I say this to one another all the time, you can have it all. You just can't have it all at the same time. And that is, to me, is a wonderful way of thinking about it, because, you know, when my son was small, was I working as hard? No, I was not. I was working hard, but yeah, I was raising a young child. So of course I wasn't working quite as hard. And part of what I had to do at that time in my life was ratchet down a little bit on other things that were in my life in order to make sure I had the time for my job and for my family. But at other times in my life, I have been able to ratchet those other things up. So you can have it all, but you just can't have it all at the same time. I think is an empowering way to think about the kinds of things that Hilarie was talking about in terms of life changes and goals changing and things like that.
And it's something that we all have to reevaluate on an ongoing basis. You know, once a year to sit back and say, you know, I really didn't spend any time with my friends this year, and that's a priority for me. How do I figure out a way to do better at that? Or I'm not spending the same kind of time that I would like with my elderly parents. Look, everybody faces these challenges, lawyers and non-lawyers alike. And what it requires is obviously really great organization, but just focus on right now, what's your priority? Obviously, when you're in the middle of a trial, everything else falls by the wayside. You're not picking up your child from school. You're not having dinner with friends. You're not spending time with your spouse. Everybody gets that. So the question is, when you're not in that stressful situation, how do you try and rebalance, recalibrate, so that you're making up, not for lost time, you're never going to be able to do that, but at least say, you know what, I'm going to make more of an effort to add this to my life, or I haven't worked out in 2 months because I was so busy on this trial. I'm going to make that a priority. So to Trish's point, you're never going, there's only 24 hours in a day, and hopefully you're getting some of them in sleep hours. But
Hilarie,
it does
there's a
require
yeah.
constant analysis so that you can recalibrate on an ongoing basis.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. I hate Zoom sometimes, but there was a question about whether you and I do mentoring and whether we're too busy with other things to focus on mentoring. So let me take a crack at that. And then I'm sure they want to hear from you too on this topic. There is nothing really on my list that's more important than mentoring, particularly mentoring other women, although I hope there are young male lawyers in my law firm and maybe some not so young male lawyers who would say that I'm a mentor for them as well. And for me, the imperative around that is the really basic notion that I can't adequately pay back the people who mentored me and who still do mentor me, right? I mean, you don't ever get to a place in your life or career where you don't need mentors. I can't repay them directly. And so this notion of paying it forward is very real to me, because I am so indebted to the men and women who helped me to get where I am now. And so I am serious about being a mentor. I make a personal effort to make sure that I don't ever say no when a young lawyer says, can I talk to you? Would you have lunch with me? Can we have coffee? Whatever it is, to help and listen and offer to them the advice and wisdom to the extent I have any. Sometimes all I'm doing, you understand, is passing on the wisdom that I was given as opposed to anything that I figured out on my own. But if it's helped me, then I can give it to someone else to help them. So each of us has a moral imperative to do mentoring in our profession, of men and of women, and in particular of those who, for whatever reason, may be disadvantaged in the legal profession, to try and bring them forward.
But to that point, let me suggest there's a lot that's been written and said about formal mentoring relationships. And I've always found that the best mentors come spontaneously. Now, what does that mean? It means I don't recommend you go in and ask somebody whose career you admire, will you be my mentor? Because the typical reaction, at least internally, when someone comes in and says that, I'm thinking, oh, that's just what I need. One more person I have to take to lunch once a month and check in on once a week. You don't need to do that. Just go into somebody whose careers you admire and you think would have wisdom that could be imparted to you and say, I so admire your career and what you've accomplished. Can I take you out for a cup of coffee or for a quick lunch? People love to talk about how they got successful. People love to talk about themselves. So if you make it more about them than about you, chances are it's more likely to happen. And then once you have the opportunity to spend time together, if there's a connection, that person is likely to have an interest in your career going forward, and you can follow up with it on an informal basis. But there's so many people that you can learn from as a young lawyer that I don't think it necessarily requires this formal mentorship where you meet on an ongoing basis like clockwork. There are lots of people you can learn from, and every one of them can serve as an informal mentor for you.
Absolutely. And they don't have to be, 2 decades senior to you either. Hilarie's mentored me. And I like to think maybe a little bit. I've mentored Hilarie over the years, right? But we're age compatriots, obviously, but we've known one another for 1,000 years, and we help each other, and that's a part of mentoring too. Building the strong relationships. And by the way, I should say that's one of the cool things about the organized bar, because it allows you to meet other men and women outside of your practice setting, whatever that is. I mean, in your case, your legal aid office, and connect to people who do something different, but who share the lawyer piece. And one of the things that I learned very clearly in this last year as ABA president is that lawyers around the globe have way more in common than we have differences. And that's true certainly in our own country as well. And so any lawyer whom you meet and have the chance to connect with, which is kind of what the organized bar is all about, gives you the opportunity to make other relationships with new people who can in turn then become your mentors and whom you can mentor.
Absolutely. Another part of the organized bar that proved to be tremendously valuable to me is that you can really achieve tremendous success by making very little effort. I mean, if you're willing to commit an hour a month to a committee, you're suddenly a superstar. And those leadership positions really help train you for leadership positions outside of the bar, whether it's in your legal aid office or in your community. The experience of being given a problem and figuring out how to engage other people to help you solve it and coming up with a work product or whatever, it's invaluable experience. And of course, to Tricia's point, the best part of being involved in the organized bar is the relationships, because you really end up finding friends and mentors throughout the country in your area of expertise and out that you never would have had the opportunity to meet if you simply went to work every day and came home and dealt with your family. It's a real expansion of your horizons that's invaluable. And so many of my closest friends in the world came out of not my law practice, not my local bar, but the American Bar Association, because they were people with whom I had so much in common and yet would never have had the opportunity to meet, but for being a participant in the organized bar.
Absolutely right. And I hope all of you know, this is slightly off topic, but I hope all of you know that from the American Bar Association perspective, the #1 legislative priority of the American Bar Association for years and years and years and years has been funding for the Legal Services Corporation. That is a serious and important aspect of the work that the ABA does in Washington and lobbying on Capitol Hill. So all of you guys, from our perspective, are, if you'll let me say it this way, sort of doing the Lord's work as far as I'm concerned. And it's a particular honor and privilege to be with this group on this important topic. Christy, are there other questions that we should cover?
Yes, I was just going to pop in and remind everyone that the ABA does have a very generously discounted membership for public interest attorneys. And there's also the option for your whole firm to join for a really reasonable price. So definitely encourage your leadership to do that. The ABA is not only supporting legal aid and legal services, but also running some amazing programs over the past year and a half during COVID. We did have a couple questions come in. How do you focus on or prioritize self-promotion as a woman without sounding like you're a disgruntled feminist and really get men to listen when you feel you've been neglected or passed over because you are a woman?
Well, I always come down to facts matter. I think it's really important for any woman lawyer to keep an ongoing list of the cases they think they've handled successfully, their summary judgment wins, whatever it is in your particular area of practice. And when you come in and you talk to your supervisor or whoever it is, it's perhaps making decisions about compensation or promotion, you're not there to bitch and moan, you're there to advocate. You're an advocate. Stick to the facts. I've had a great year. I got this and this and this and this, and I want to be treated fairly based on those results. And I don't think you sound like a disgruntled feminist if you focus on the facts. And if you happen to know that there are disparities between the way other people are being treated and the way you're being treated, don't personalize it. But again, stick to the facts. Say, I've had an exceptional year. In fact, I've had more success than this other person who just got a promotion or just got a pay raise above mine. So try and keep the personalities out of it and focus on the results that you've achieved.
Yeah, and to the extent you can't always be positive, always be positive. No one is persuasive, in my judgment, when we are talking negatively. That's an overstatement, but you understand the point. The more we can speak in a positive, forward-looking, this is where I'm going, and here are the facts that got me to here, and here's where I'm going, the better off we are.
And of course, in legal aid, we can't focus on, how many billable hours we had or what business we brought in. So focus on your client successes. If you do disability law, veterans disability, or any kind of disability, or if you're helping with food stamp appeals, like you erase this much debt for this many families, that's a big deal. Great advice from you guys. It's been so much fun having you here. Okay, so next question, and I reminded everyone you can ask questions anonymously if you put them in the Q&A box. So if you're afraid to ask about anything, just click the little anonymous box. Do you think that the cost of law school and student debt limits the diversity in the bar?
Yes.
Agreed. Not much question about that.
Yeah, I mean, and the American Bar Association is working very hard on the whole law school debt issue. We all know it's too expensive. The public service loan forgiveness program is an important assistance, right, for folks who go into a public interest practice setting, but there's way more that needs to be done on the topic of law school debt, for sure. And yes,
And we're working it.
It's a diversity problem in every respect.
And the Young Lawyers Division of the ABA has set aside this week in particular to focus on student debt. And they're sending out letters to Congress members, et cetera, because everybody recognizes this is a critical issue and we have to deal with it. It's got to be dealt with at the legislative level. Not to mention that the PSLRB, the ABA has been an important advocate. We actually litigated over it because, as many of you know, the Department of Education has been inundated with applications for loan forgiveness because people have now reached the 10 years. And the number of people who've actually had their debt extinguished has been minuscule. So there's much more we have to do on that side of the equation as well to ensure that people who made commitments, whether it was to legal aid or other similar organizations with the expectation that they could look forward to debt forgiveness, get what it was they were promised.
That is a little terrifying to me personally. I feel like it's a wing and a prayer that it'll get forgiven in the near
There's no reason for that. I mean, a promise was made. You relied on that promise and spent 10 years making the payments you were required with the expectation that if you stayed in that job, the loan was going to be forgiven. And now you're sitting around waiting for the Department of Education to make a decision based on criteria that have not been articulated. So we all recognize that it's something that we're actively lobbying about.
I definitely appreciate the ABA's advocacy on that. You know what was surprising to me, kind of related to the law school question in the ABA's in their own words report, is that subject you guys brought up at the beginning, that there are a lot more women going to law school. So they're making that commitment, they're spending that time and money, but then they're not staying in the profession. So if you all were in a perfect world, what do you think it would take to keep women in the profession, whether it's legal aid or private law?
I would say the number one thing is for them to perceive they're being treated fairly.
Yeah,
Very
I
simple.
mean, I think she's exactly right. That is why most women, when you boil it down, that is why most women leave, whatever their practice setting. They don't feel they're being treated fairly. And again,
Study after
that's
study
another
says
one of those
we
head
love the
scratchers.
work.
Right.
Mhm.
Women lawyers love the intellectual stimulation. They love the client interaction. They love the solving of the problems. But year after year after year, if they perceive that they're not being treated fairly, that male colleagues that perhaps are not as competent are being treated differently than they are, getting more promotions, getting more compensation, at some point you throw up your hands and say, this is too hard for me to spend the rest of my life knocking my head against the wall. And that's
Right.
one of the reasons that the ABA is so focused on ensuring that women and diverse lawyers get a fair shake.
That makes sense. That was really surprising to me in that report, that we are not approaching gender equity at all, even with the numbers of women coming through law school. I think it said it will reach equity in 100 years.
That's
So got a lot of work to do. I have some happy news in the chat. Someone wrote that they received forgiveness of federal loans through the public interest program this year, $140,000. So there is
Congratulations, that's great news.
yay.
Yes.
I've got a giant folder of all my documentation. Like every year I send it in. I have one last question for you. And I can't remember if this was in any of the ABA reports, but there's been a trend towards a focus on wellness programs. And of course, legal aid doesn't have money for like a yoga room or really any sort of wellness program. But my concern about any of this wellness focus is that it's focused on the individual. Like, here, add this to your to-do list yourself. But do you have any recommendations for how leadership can encourage wellness for free, preferably in the legal aid world?
So let me suggest that you download on the American Bar Association website a wellness handbook that focuses on what everybody in the profession needs to do. It's directed to judges, it's directed to law partners, managers, as well as individual lawyers. And at each step, there are very specific suggestions about things we can do to help each other. Everything as simple as don't impose deadlines when there's really no need for them, to giving a Friday off once a month. I mean, there's a whole list of really valuable suggestions that was put together by a working group at the American Bar Association in consultation with Hazelton and a number of other experts. There are things we can all do to help each other.
There's also an ABA lawyer wellness pledge for legal employers that has a pledge that the paycheck writer agrees to, in terms of how the paycheck writer is going to deal with employees and make sure in the legal profession that their employees have wellness. And so we have signatories from law firms, from law departments in corporate settings, and we could have lots more signatories from the legal services community as well.
Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions, but it was such an honor to have both of you here. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And CLE has been approved, including the coveted bias elimination credit for the Florida Bar. So that number is 5574, again, 5574. But do you have any last words you want to leave everyone with before we let you go?
Just continue to work hard. It's a wonderful profession. Being a lawyer, I think, is one of the most satisfying careers we can have, and we can all help each other have that satisfaction in our careers that we all long for.
And regardless of where one is on the political spectrum, the rule of law is under threat in this country and around the world in ways that lawyers must care about. So as we help our individual clients with their individual problems, we also need to keep an eye on the bigger issue of the rule of law in our nation and around the world.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you so
Indeed.
much. Lots of compliments and thank yous in the chat box. So thank you so much for doing this for us. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.